a role I've had for the last 2 months and a role I'll have for 3 more days. Our new executive director, Jim White, starts on Monday. And for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to meet him, you'll have other opportunities over the coming months. We're going to get him out to lots of different events so everyone can meet him. He is fabulous, fabulous, fabulous. And he is currently wrapping up a position as Vice President for Operations at Mercy Corps, a position he holds until Friday. So we're giving him 2 days to rest and relax, and then he's going to start things off in NAO. As Lisa mentioned, I'm going to present an overview of our Oregon nonprofit sector report. You can find the full report and the full executive summary on our website, nonprofitoregon.org. I love data and I love statistics, and just now sitting at the table having a cup of coffee, Julia from Susan Matlock Jones said, "How many nonprofits are there in Oregon?" And normally I would just tell her, but I didn't. I said, "You have to wait. I have to keep some information for the presentation." So I want to just give you a little bit of background about NAO. The Nonprofit Association of Oregon is a nonprofit itself. We've been around since 1977 as a training and consulting resource for nonprofits. And we now say that we're in the business of building nonprofit capacity. And we do this because we believe that by creating strong nonprofits, we're creating strong communities throughout Oregon. And that really is our vision. And that's why we do this work. This is also in the handouts you have on the table, if you want to take a closer look. This is our sort of the cover page of our strategic plan. And we do have a strategic direction that provides focus and guidance for our work. We update it every year as part of an annual planning cycle, and it includes 5 key strategies for success and then a whole bunch of goals and priorities that help us implement that plan. So we collect data and conduct evaluation in order to monitor our progress against our strategic plan. And we think that data and evaluation are very important, and we hope that all of you do as well. And one of the reasons, in addition to monitoring how well we do our own work, one of the reasons we do collect data and interpret it is to allow us to fully meet our mission as a capacity builder. We want to advocate on behalf of the sector, and in order to do that, we have to be knowledgeable about the sector, and all of you have to be knowledgeable about the sector. And having data like this, just the tip of the iceberg that I'm going to present, allows us to effectively communicate and inform decision makers in philanthropy, in government, in business, even at the ballot box or the mailbox here in Oregon. And I hope that you're all also able to use this data to support the work that you do and to help inform the folks that you work with throughout your community. So this slide simply highlights some of the data sources that informed this particular presentation, and you could use these all as resources as well. So here's the answer to Julia's question: how many nonprofits are there in Oregon? So these stats are fresh from the National Center for Charitable Statistics, a great place to go for information about states as well as individual counties if you'd like to drill down farther on these statistics. So in the most recent reporting year, there were over 22,000 nonprofits in Oregon, and over 15,000 of those are public charities. How many folks in this room are 501c3 tax-exempt organizations? We are. So a lot. How many? I know there's at least one C6 in here. How many are C6s? Okay, how about 4s? All right, is there anybody I missed? Is there anyone who doesn't fall into one of those 3 categories? So most of the statistics in here are going to apply to the C3s, and I'll note when there's something different. But that's really the subset that we're focused on. Those public charities, those of us who can solicit and accept tax-deductible contributions. There's also 1,200 private foundations and about 6,300 other nonprofits like chambers, business leagues, fraternal orders, ag organizations, that sort of thing. And I included a snapshot, too, of how we looked 10 years ago. So while there's been constriction, particularly in fraternal orders and that part of the nonprofit sector, there's been a big jump in public charities. So that's about a 50% increase. And I did check the census data. Oregon's population rose 12% in that same amount of time. So we've seen a big boom in nonprofits in the last decade. So in terms of regions, we have nonprofits split all around the state, but there is a significant concentration where our population centers are split down that kind of I-5 corridor, and just under half of us are in the Portland metro area. So there's more detail on this as well in the handouts. I printed out the whole subsector breakdown of public charities from the National Center for Charitable Statistics. But education nonprofits are the most plentiful in the state, followed by arts, culture, and humanities. And then our social and human service organizations are right behind. So nonprofits are really serving a huge range of needs in our community and really enriching the lives of all Oregonians. This is budget size, which I always find very interesting. This is a comparison with national. So you can see that while, yes, it's very common to be a small nonprofit, here in Oregon, we have a lot of very small nonprofits. That 100,000 and under category is 71% of those 15,000 nonprofits. And I'm wondering, by a quick show of hands, how many folks in this room are in that smallest category? Your budget's $100,000 or less. So there's a few of you. I'm wondering, how many of you have budgets under 500,000? How many of you are $500,000 and less? So maybe almost half the room. That's very interesting because, of course, this room then probably skews towards the mid-size and larger organizations. I also will note that about 9,000 of those 15,000 public charities actually have budgets under $25,000 a year. So that's, looking at that 71% figure, a big chunk of those are even smaller than 100,000. So those are the facts, like those are the stats on our sector here in Oregon. And now I'm going to share some key findings, both from the Oregon Nonprofit Sector Report, but from some of those other data sources that I mentioned as well. So I wanted to start with employment and volunteers, because this is always the information that most interests people. So of those, this is a place where we're talking about more than just the public charities. Of those more than 22,000 nonprofits in Oregon, 8,500, a little more than 8,500, 8,519 have payroll. So that means that there's over 14,000 nonprofits here in Oregon that are providing their programs and services entirely with volunteers. And I know those of us in the room aren't surprised to hear either that nonprofits are significant employers, nor that nonprofits are doing a lot of work with volunteers. But I talk to a lot of people around the state who are surprised to hear that I work for a nonprofit and I get paid for it. I even had reporters call and ask, is that okay that a nonprofit pays people? Or is all nonprofit payroll overhead? So there's a lot of misperception out there, and I think this is an important statistic to let people know that we are an economic force. This small fraction of nonprofits that have paid employment employ 13% of the private sector workforce. We're on par with manufacturing. So we do have economic influence and power in Oregon, and we need to keep reminding people about that. Here's a kind of a fun one. nonprofit organizations. And while, yes, this just represents paid staff and probably several paid staff in a given organization, I'm using it as a proxy. Even if you have one paid staff, even if your executive director is your only paid employee, this is, to me, a representation of how we're spending our time. And the fact of the matter is, we do, as we all know, spend most of our time delivering our programs and services. But then we also need to put on all those different hats, or like the little octopus, I guess, put on lots of different arms, and do all the other things that have to be done in order to successfully operate our nonprofit organizations. And while we're talking about employment, I also want to note that the Oregon Nonprofit Sector Report explored the diversity of Oregon nonprofits. And the average nonprofit is 76% female. And a third of nonprofits that responded to the survey have only women on staff. Where you begin to see more men in an organization is when you have larger budget organizations. They tend to employ more men. And smaller budget organizations employ more women. Now, another note about diversity, Oregon's population overall is 84% white, and the average nonprofit is 72% white. So Oregon's nonprofits are more diverse relative to the state's population. And here's a quote from the sector report. There was a significant correlation between organization size and percentage of employees that are people of color. Bigger organizations are less racially diverse, which to me is a very, very interesting statistic. And so hopefully in future years, we'll be able to probe a little more deeply into those stats. Now, quickly to talk about volunteers. We all require volunteers to function, and Oregon has one of the highest rates of volunteerism in the country. Way to go, Oregon. We're number 14. I was going to get rid of those big foamy finger number 14s made up, but didn't have a chance yet. And then quickly, we found in the sector report that 41% of nonprofits reported that they lost volunteers between 2010 and 2011. So even though there's a lot of folks volunteering, I think there's a lot of churn as well in organizations. And I wanted to just highlight some volunteer recruitment tools. What's number one? Word of mouth. And the irony is, if you go back to that little pie chart that shows how we're spending our time, the smallest chunk is volunteer management. So here we are devoting limited time to volunteer management, and we have high volunteer turnover. We're relying on word of mouth for volunteers. So it's important for all of us to kind of keep that in mind and try to create really high quality experiences for our volunteers. This is my favorite part, finance. And I hope you love it too. Here's information about change in total revenue. So coming out of those recession years from 2010 to 2011, a lot of us did pretty well. We either stayed the course, 20% stayed about the same. We have a significant percentage who saw some increase in revenue in those years. Notably, though, about a quarter of organizations saw revenue decrease. Now, this may not be bad if it was planned constriction, but there is some reason to keep an eye on all of our organizations as we continue, hopefully, to move out of the recession. We'll continue to track on how we're all faring. So here's stability and revenue mix I want to look at. So I know at NAO we talk a lot about, you've probably heard that a diversified income stream means you're a more resilient and healthy nonprofit. And so here's the aggregate of the average percentage of budget from different revenue sources. And 80% of us rely on some level of foundation funding, but it averages less than 20% of a typical nonprofit budget in Oregon. And I know that a lot of us feel really dependent on foundation grants, but they come and go in big chunks, and that can be challenging if you're overly dependent on them. And then there's also individual giving and some earned income in these revenue mixes. According to the sector report, 33% of nonprofits rely only on contributed income, so foundation funding, individual giving, etc. And then fewer than half of us have government funding. So what we found from the sector report was that fundraising was where a lot of us turned during the recession in order to stabilize or even increase income if we needed to. And since over half of an average nonprofit's income is from fundraising, I just wanted to highlight the most common strategies. Ironically, going to foundations with grant applications was the #1 strategy, but a lot of us also paid more attention to individual donors, and we also added some special events, which is a lot of work, and also expanded our marketing efforts, which is probably a good idea as well, to let people know that we're out there. So financial resiliency is, like I said, is important, and having some cash available to weather a shortfall or invest in an opportunity is definitely a measure of a healthy nonprofit. And looking at how much money we have available for those opportunities or to overcome those challenges is a measure of financial health that we track. And a significant 25% of Oregon nonprofits are weeks or even days away from running out of cash. And that is a slightly higher percentage than the national statistics. So in Oregon, we are playing it a little closer to the bone here than folks are around the country. More encouragingly, however, and in line with national statistics, is that about half of nonprofits have at least 4 months of cash on hand. So planning. Here's a list of different plans that your organization might or might not have. But at NAO, we do believe that effective organizations apply strategic thinking in deliberate ways and plan for the future. And these are examples of documents that your organization ideally has in place at some level to help you meet your goals and take some planned and thoughtful action. So the good news is a lot of us have a strategic plan in place. Although based on some other indicators that I'm not going to show here, those plans are not well socialized within our organizations. And in fact, if you skip down from strategic plan to annual operations plan, there's a 35% gap between the strategic plan and that operations plan, which may indicate that our strategic plans are not being implemented effectively in our organizations. And also notable is that fundraising plan is a much lower percentage than strategic plan, when I think a lot of us would hope that a fundraising plan would be a key part of a strategic plan. So these are all things we're going to continue to track over time, but you should all think about as well as you're kind of putting together your planning cycles for your organizations. All right, leadership. This is an executive directors network, and I want to be sure we get through discussion of executive director tenure. So hopefully we have time for a super quick show of hands here. How many of you executive directors in the room have been with your organizations in that 0 to 3 year period? All right, not too many. How about 3 to 10 years? All right, and then more than 10? A few. So some hands didn't go up, so we've got a lot of different roles in the room. But I don't know, maybe it was split into thirds. So Oregon sort of tracks on the national data, and we have about a third of EDs in each of these different categories, which is great because it means there's a range of perspectives and insights that can inform our field. But knowing that there's 8,500 nonprofits with payroll, this means that about 2,800 nonprofits at any given time are experiencing a very new ED or maybe some ED turnover if you look at that 0 to 3 year period. And conversely, at the other end, there's 2,800 nonprofits that have an ED who's been there more than 10 years, which can be good and it can be not good, but it could also indicate a possible transition as that person moves on to another job or retires. So we have an opportunity and a challenge potentially in the field in that we will likely continue to see a lot of ED transition and turnover. And here's board engagement. The number one activity that nonprofits said that their boards are very actively engaged in is, fortunately, financial oversight. Unfortunately, only 60% of organizations reported that as boards engaged very actively in financial oversight, which is too bad because that's the number one legal responsibility of boards. So we'd like to see that pushed up a little farther. And then there's a range of other activities that boards are engaged in, and maybe some of them look familiar to you. And then I wanted to mention board recruitment, and this is a kind of a fun one. If you look at the criteria for board member recruitment, number one, no kidding, willingness to commit time. We want someone who's actually going to show up and do something. So briefly, collaboration. As NAO went around the state these past 2 years doing our town hall listening sessions, collaboration came up again and again. And around the state, collaboration is important to nonprofits, and it's important to funders as well. We're hearing that funders want to see nonprofits collaborating with each other and in their communities and leveraging the assets that already exist. So 86% of respondents in the ONSR, the Oregon Nonprofit Sector Report, collaborate with other nonprofits. So almost all of us collaborate with other nonprofits, most frequently for program delivery. Fewer of us are collaborating with government and business, and that's one that I hope we see pushing up over time. Finally, I want to touch briefly on some public policy. We've asked nonprofits how engaged they are in public policy, and specifically in contacting elected officials. About half of nonprofits have been in contact with an elected official, and I'm proud to say that when we poll NAO members, that figure is 60%. So NAO members are a little more likely to be in contact with a public official than a typical nonprofit. And this figure does vary. It's generally 50%, but in some communities around the state, it's much lower, and in some communities, it's much higher. And the variability is really found in rural Oregon. And then about 32% of nonprofits do participate in coalitions, which is another important collaboration if you're trying to influence decision making. See, finally, this is my last slide. We asked in the Oregon Nonprofit Sector Report, where do you see your organization in 5 years? The good news is we all expect that we're still going to be around in 5 years, which I think is a positive outlook. And I'm pretty sure that based on the statistics we saw at the beginning, we probably won't be alone. I'm sure there'll be many more nonprofits around in 5 years, and hopefully we're all strong and healthy. I'm happy to answer questions later on in the session, and I'll be around, of course, until noon. So feel free to ask me any questions, and if you'd like more information, check out our website or let me know, and we'll send it to you. Thanks very much. I appreciate it.